Jonathan Goins from our Lexington office, who's the Director of Education Policy up at CSG. I'd like to take care of a little bit of housekeeping items. First off, as you just heard, all of y'all are in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on the GoToWebinar toolbar. We'll be recording this webinar, and we'll take those questions, hold on to them unless we have to interrupt in the flow and answer them then, but we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentation. We will be recording the webinar and posting it later on to the CSG Knowledge Center website, which is available at knowledgecenter.csg.org. It'll also be available through the SLC website at slcatlanta.org. By way of introduction to today's program, in 2010, the Tennessee General Assembly passed the Complete College Tennessee Act, which created a novel approach to funding for higher education that uses meaningful measures of outcomes and success for the state's many institutions of higher education, while respecting the great variety of purpose that exists among those schools. We are joined today by two gentlemen from the Tennessee Higher Education Commission who are charged with implementing the Act. Dr. Russ Deaton, Associate Executive Director for Fiscal Policy and Administration with the Commission, and David Wright, Chief Policy Officer for the Commission. Dr. Deaton serves as the Commission's Chief Fiscal Officer, was central to the development of the state's higher education funding formula, tuition policy, and financial aid research. He has designed several higher education finance policy tools for state government, including a tuition model and, most recently, the outcomes-based funding formula that we are discussing today. Mr. Wright, who is the Chief Policy Officer for the Commission, routinely advises the governor's staff, legislature, and campus leaders on policy matters related to higher education. His office also provides research reports and statistical data to system leaders, college presidents, campus personnel, and the public. I'm going to now hand over the program to Dr. Deaton and Mr. Wright. Please feel free, again, to submit your questions as they come up through the question box, and we will take them up, submit them throughout the program. We'll take them at the end unless there's a pressing question we have to interrupt the flow for. And again, thank you very much. Without further ado, Dr. Deaton and Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is David, and we want to thank all of you for making some time in your afternoon schedule to be with us and visit with us about the Tennessee experience with respect to not only higher ed finance reform, but higher ed policy reform and agenda setting in Tennessee. Because one of the points that we'll try to make as we go along is that the funding formula, which I'm sure is what most of you are interested in, really sprang from a context that was many years in the making, but specifically 2 years prior to the passage of the CCTA, we really began, the Complete College Tennessee Act, CCTA. 2 years earlier is when we really began to focus on completion as the agenda for higher education in Tennessee. So the way we'll break down the presentation is that David, will talk a little bit about the lead up to the CCTA, what's in the CCTA, and establish that context for the funding formula that Russ will then address in the second half of the presentation. Russ will sort of do a how-to with how the funding formula was built, and then answer any questions that you all may have about how it works and what's counted and what's not. And we'd be happy to then reflect on potential tweaks to the formula that we've considered since we've developed this. So Heather, you'll take me to the next slide. We'll get started. Before I get into the specifics, I'd just like you to know what kind of system we have in Tennessee. It's kind of a classic coordinating board system. You've got the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, which, of course, answers to the governor, the General Assembly, and the citizens of Tennessee. And we sit between two governing boards, the Tennessee Board of Regents, which is a system of 6 universities, 13 community colleges, and technology centers. Technology centers are the institutions that grant less than 2-year awards. And the University of Tennessee system, which has the 4 campuses and some institutes. The Tennessee Board of Regents is the larger of the 2 systems. And our job is to do a master plan for higher education every 5 years, We do the budget request for the systems. We recommend the tuition rates. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, research in support of policy development for the system. Okay. Next slide. Well, I arrived in Tennessee in 2000 from the state of Colorado. I also worked in Florida and Arkansas. But when I arrived, my reflection on the state is what's on this slide. Policy, you could argue, was set by a master plan for higher education. However, there was not much, it wasn't paid much attention to by the institutions, and I think that's just because there wasn't much point. The state goals that the master plan might have elucidated, and the funding, that was flowing to the institutions. The funding was based on an enrollment-based formula that itself, even for all of its faults, had not been fully funded since the mid-90s. And so they're really driving institutional behavior in their own individual goals or graphics. And so consequently, the schools are in high growth areas, and there was really, as I said, just a lot of ennui, maybe I'd say that, in the system. It was not going in any particular direction. So we had a performance funding program that a lot of people have heard about. I need to stress from the get-go that performance funding with capital P and capital F is a distinct program from our new outcomes-based funding formula. The historical performance funding program allocated about 5.5% of the budget on measures that were tied to the master plan. And Tennessee was rightly proud of this system, but there had been a couple of research studies done recently that had showed that the performance funding program, for all its merit, was not having any real impact on outcomes in the state. Next slide. So as far as what was the physical context for when we began to think about completion as an agenda, as is probably the case in most of your states, fewer state dollars for institutions, 20% cut over the last 5 years. We do have a robust merit scholarship program, the Tennessee Education Lottery Scholarship, that began in 2004. It is merit-based. There is a need component to it, and we also have a program for needy adults, so there are some good components to it, but it is primarily rewarding better prepared, better off financially students. And so, again, we're now in the era of the Complete Tennessee Act, beginning to re-examine all the programs for how well they align with the completion agenda. But when we began to think about this, none of this sort of governed the thinking in the state. We had moderate growth, as again, as I said, sort of driven by the demographics. Institutions continued to battle, cost inflation of 3%, 4%, 5% a year. And with the state dollars going on and the enrollments going up and inflation, being sort of a constant pressure, of course you had this tuition spiral, and all this was made even worse by the recent recession. And next slide. So here's a picture of kind of the effect of the preceding conditions that I just talked about on total revenue per student, per full-time equivalent student in our public universities. I'll just show the picture for the universities. However, we do have a slide just like this for the community colleges, and it looks exactly the same except for the dollar amounts are adjusted down a little bit. But what you see is, over time, instructional spending per student has really not increased very much. In fact, it's gone down recently in the last couple of years. But the way that we have been able to maintain that total revenue per student is by charging more tuition to make up the gap that's been left by decrease in state appropriations. I should say this is inflation adjusted over time, and if you look at the purple or the plum-colored bars from 2008-9 to 10-11, that represents the federal ARRA and maintenance of effort money, which helped us sort of keep from degrading the total revenues per student too much during that time. But when that federal money went away, then you can see in 11-12 we sort of had a precipitous decline of $1,000 per student or so in instructional revenue per student. Okay? And so our view was that this is not a sustainable situation, and we could no longer afford to just write the next master plan for higher education and hope for things to change. There was a serious sea change that was needed. Fortunately for us, back in 2007, I believe it was, we were afforded the opportunity to apply for a Lumina grant through a program called Making Opportunity Affordable. And the idea was that states had no choice, given the increasing demand for higher education and the fiscal situation in states. States had no choice but to basically pursue a completion agenda that said the following. We know that there is not going to be an influx of state money for institutional operations. So we've got to learn how to increase the numbers of students with graduating from our institutions with degrees and certificates within available state resources. Now that includes not just the state appropriations, but the tuition revenues. And we have to do this without any decrease in quality. That was a three-pronged, very challenging agenda. We said, well, it sounds right to us, and so we applied for one of these grants and were awarded one of the grants. We were one of 7 states, and that really set us on a path that would eventually result in passage of the Complete College Tennessee Act. I guess what I'm trying to say there is that when we got to the point of the act being passed, we'd done a lot of thinking about what it was we needed and how we would get there, and so a lot of those concepts that we had developed over the last 2 years made their way into the act, and that has really helped us hit the ground running, I guess. Okay, next slide. So again, the fiscal circumstances were pretty unprecedented. We really tried to focus on aligning policies so that there were no gaps in the educational pipeline. It doesn't make sense for us to worry about remedial and developmental placement rates in our colleges if the colleges weren't doing a good job of communicating to the high schools what the expectations were, and so students would be showing up, in need of remedial and developmental work. So we did a policy audit back in 2009, and the result of that document, which is on our website, was they identified some 12, 13 areas where we had policy misalignments, where if you're trying to pursue an agenda of college completion, you've got to address these gaps. And it so happened that our funding formula policy was one of those that was identified. Next slide, please. What's in the Complete College Tennessee Act? In January of 2010, the Tennessee General Assembly in special session passed 2 acts. One was the First to the Top Act, which made some reforms to K-12 education that allowed us to be competitive for federal Race to the Top dollars, and we were one of the first 2 states that was awarded a Race to the Top grant as a result. In that same special session, though, the Complete College Tennessee Act was passed, and it had several sections, and I've sort of just summarized them here on one slide. First of all, we were charged to develop a new public agenda. We used to call this the master plan, but a public agenda for higher education that focused primarily on one thing, that is increasing the educational attainment of Tennessee's citizens. And the way to do that was to make material gains in the numbers of students who graduate from our colleges, universities, and tech centers with degrees and certificates. This was important because in the past our master plans had tried to be all things to all people, try to touch on all the values that are important to the many different constituent groups of higher education. And those are always there, they're still there, but the legislature was basically telling higher education, job one, what the state needs from you most of anything is to help us with our educational attainment problem. And at the time we were 44th nationally in the percentage of our working age population with a college degree. I think we're up to 42nd now, and we track every year the increase in the rankings that we do, and just paying attention to that has really helped us. The legislation also required that we develop an outcomes-based funding formula. That's what Russ is going to talk the second half about with you, and it included some of the types of elements that were to be used in the formula. One of the interesting changes was that we no longer count enrollments. Whenever we count enrollments, we don't ever count them on census date, the 14th day of classes. Historically, this is when we took our counts, and it led to all sorts of perverse behaviors of classes being stacked full on the second week, but then there was no real motivation for instructors to worry about what happened to those students after that. Now, I'm not saying that instructors didn't care. I'm just saying that there was no motivation built into the system, and so this law changed that and said whenever you count enrollments now, count end of term. So you build in this retention. If you believe the retention happens one course at a time, you sort of build in that incentive into the way you do your counts. It's very organically done. Mission differentiation, I'm going to talk about this more in a second, but basically it's recognizing that any system of funding you come up with has to realize that one size will not fit all in terms of which measures should be used and how they should be weighted relative to another institution. Student success is a big part of the Complete College Tennessee Act. We're not going to be successful as a state in increasing our educational attainment rates unless we help students succeed at every stage of the pipeline. That means better high school, more rigorous high school graduation requirements, more attention to increasing the college-going rates of traditionally underrepresented groups, and then working with remedial and developmental so that it's done in a more productive manner. Several things to improve transfer experience for students, a gen ed, common gen ed core that's fully transferable from one institution to the next, and then focusing on our community colleges operating more as a integrated system rather than just a collection of 13 different institutions. And Russ could maybe talk a little bit more about that, but I know there's been some common purchasing and things of that nature that have gone on, branding, marketing that look at the system as a whole and what is the message that we want students to hear about our community college system. And then finally, there are some regional research partnerships, one in Oak Ridge, one in Memphis, that were recognized by this legislation. And you can see there at the bottom of the slide, if you go to the THEC website, you can find out more about the Complete College Tennessee Act. Okay, next. I'll end my section really quickly here. I wanted to say the public agenda was primarily about increasing educational attainment. I said that earlier. Even the word public agenda, that was intentional. Master plans connote something that was developed top-down, something that we're doing to the institutions, whereas public agenda was really a more accurate term. We brought together institutional representatives over the course of 9 months and decided what our shared destiny was, and so we use the words public agenda now instead of master plan, although sometimes I do slip and say master plan. And we stayed narrowly focused in this public agenda document on implementing the CCTA, did not talk so much about things that didn't have to do with degree attainment and how that ties into the state's economic and workforce development. Okay, next. If you would go on to the next slide, it's a picture of what's on that slide. This is a picture of the big goal in Tennessee. Lumina Foundation, which had funded our productivity grant initiative work, urged us to come up with a big goal to sort of animate activity in the state, so that's what we did. Oddly enough, in a state like Tennessee, our big goal saw us striving to reach the national average by 2025, whereas, you know, you might say, well, why don't you want to be number one? Well, we did the math and figured that even if we became the best overnight at high school graduation rates and college participation rates, retention rates, graduation rates, all that, we would not get to where we would like to go. And so we sort of stepped back and said, well, let's try to reach the national average by 2025. And even to do that, we have to increase degree production by 4% every year between now and 2025, or we won't get to that. So we're seeking to get from 44th when we started all this in terms of the degree attainment of our adult residents to somewhere in the 20s, and that would be a very different economic future for the state of Tennessee. So we're talking about producing by 2025 an additional 200,000 graduates over and above what we're on track to produce right now. What we're on track to produce is represented by that blue line that has a gentle upslope, and what we're trying to produce under the Complete College Tennessee Act is represented by the red line with the steeper slope. Next. Next slide, please. There you go. This is just one little extra plug for the mission profiles, and the reason I wanted to say something about it is because it does lead right into something Russ is going to talk about in a moment. We went through an exercise of working with all the public to define who they are. Everyone knows that every college has a mission statement in their catalog. They have to have a mission statement for regional accreditation. Sometimes those mission statements can be rather aspirational, and what we asked the institutions to do was we gave them some data points and asked them to reflect on those and say, what does this tell you about the kind of institution you are and the role it is that you fill within the constellation of Tennessee institutions. And they actually came back, I thought, with some very self-reflective responses. I thought it was a good exercise. And the reason this was important is it set the stage for the weighting process in the funding formula development. And that is, Russ will tell you about the metrics that were developed for the universities and for the community colleges. But particularly on the university side, those metrics were not stressed equally amongst each of the institutions. Obviously, research is going to be more important to a University of Memphis or a University of Tennessee, Knoxville, whereas an access mission might be more important to an Austin Peay, for instance. So those things are reflected in the funding formula, and I wanted you to know that that process started back with sort of a reflection exercise when we developed mission statements. Okay? Next slide. Last but not least, I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands you're going to hear, or if you haven't already, about something called performance funding in Tennessee. It's been around for 30 years. It's distinct, separate, apart from our outcomes-based funding formula that Russ is getting ready to talk about. It's been very important to Tennessee historically as an assessment and accountability state. It was only 5.5% of the budget, but it established a culture of assessment and accountability, evaluation in the state that I think helped us when it came time to launch the Complete College Tennessee Act. The next slide, if you'll go to that, just has a brief overview of how the current performance funding cycle plays out. We've decided to focus entirely on performance funding now in the current era as a quality assurance piece. One of the questions we often receive about the funding formula is, well, aren't you guys just worrying about productivity at the expense of quality? And it's a fair question. So our response to this was to make the performance funding program, the historical program in the state, about quality, and so it's a program that has to do with student engagement, satisfaction of alumni, employers, and students with the institution, the way that students do on licensure exams and that kind of thing. And so we are trying to buttress the funding formula with a quality assurance piece, and that's what this slide reflects. So now I'm going to turn it over to Russ, because this is probably what you've been waiting to hear, to get into the actual development of the funding formula and how it operates. Russ?
Thank you, David. And Jonathan, thank you to the SLC for having us here today. Heather, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead 2 slides, please. One more. Thanks. I'm going to start here. The story that we're going to tell here sort of starts with a simple question, and it is the question that how does a state government go about making a decision to allocate taxpayer dollars to institutions? And for decades, every state has answered that question with enrollments. In Tennessee, we asked the question as part of CCTA, if you can count enrollments to fund the school, why can't you simply count up something else? And this is where that distinction that David mentioned between performance funding and what we call our outcomes-based model is really important. We decided to completely jettison the enrollment model entirely and build an outcomes model. The design that I'll show you here in a few slides, which utilizes outcomes and this mission weighting structure, is unique in higher ed finance policy. Other states are making some meaningful and incremental progress along this way, but our model has gone whole hog towards outcomes. Next slide, please, Heather. That history with performance funding, I think, taught us the limits of those programs. If you are to only allocate 5 or 10% or so of state taxpayer dollars towards performance, and the remaining 90% of your model is enrollment-based, the incentive mechanism is still towards enrollment. Therefore, our outcomes model completely replaces enrollment allocations altogether. In fact, we sometimes get squirrely looks when we tell people that the act of a student enrolling in our institutions does not trigger any funding whatsoever until they begin to accumulate hours, progress towards a degree. At that point, then, state funding follows. Next slide, please, Heather. And these next 2 slides just sort of illustrate that, just to hammer home the point. Again, previously we had performance funding attached to a largely enrollment model. The next slide shows, again, that enrollment piece falling away. The entirety of the model now is counting up something else other than enrollments, counting up outcomes. If you move to the next slide, the middle bullet here is key. Because of the use of an outcomes model rather than performance funding, we've gotten away from imposing some sort of target or goal on the systems. Instead, institutions now graduate as many people as they can, do as much research as they can. We simply count up those things they do rather than having sort of a state-imposed target that if you don't hit this predetermined target, you lose funding. And again, we're going to weight these outcomes based on mission. The next slide shows you, in fact, what it is we're talking about. This is the listing of the 10 outcomes that our formula includes for our public universities. You see the first 3, which are basically student retention and progression benchmarks. As a student accumulates hours towards a degree, we simply count up how many students hit that benchmark in a given year. We count up, of course, the number of bachelor's and master's and doctoral degrees, as well as research funding, transfer activity, and then a couple of efficiency metrics, the graduating the most obvious one. One thing about this is all of these outcomes, except for graduation rate, are not based on some sort of freshman class cohort, whether it's a part-time student, whether it's a returning adult, whether it's a student who comes in with AP credit, whatever the case may be. If a student hits these outcomes, hits these trigger points, we count that as an outcome in our model. The next slide shows that same listing but for our community colleges. And I would submit that the mission of a community college in many ways is much more complex than that of a university, and it's reflected in the wide variety of things they do for students. Again, you see progression points, and this is us, again, counting up the number of students who hit these progression points. We count up the number of dual enrollment students that the community college has. Of course, the number of associate's degrees and certificates. Job placement, which is a big part of our model. We simply count up the number of students successfully placed in a job in their field. We also have a remediation success metric as a student moves through a remediation sequence and then passes college-level work subsequent to that. We count that up. We also have a transfer outcome as well as a workforce training outcome. And this is a big one in Tennessee, as it is in many states, in certain community colleges that are strategically located next to manufacturing and factories. The more workforce training hours they do, we count those up, and that is an outcome in our model. So these last two slides have been what the outcomes are, the things we're counting up for each campus. The next slide shows you this weighting structure that David alluded to. What you're looking at is, these are for our 9 public universities. These are taking the outcomes themselves and weighting them to reflect the mission of that campus. So, for instance, the first school listed is Austin Peay State University. It's a regional liberal arts school, very limited graduate programs. Its main function in our state system is to graduate the next generation of teachers and nurses and other bachelor's degree holders. Therefore, you see in the red box there that 30% of Austin Peay's total weight is applied towards their number of bachelor's degrees produced. You also see the various weights on other outcomes. At the bottom, you see the weight applied to the graduation rate itself. These are distinct, of course. The graduation rate is what percentage of your freshmen graduate after so many years compared to the raw number of degrees you produce. This distinction, this difference in the weight, 30 and 5, we think is key because it removes the potentially insidious incentive for schools to try to increase their graduation rates by simply limiting access to students. We did not want that to happen, so for most of our schools, you see that the weight we apply to the number of degrees is largely higher than the graduation rate itself. But as you look at that slide, I know there's a lot of numbers there. Our schools here are arrayed in their order of Carnegie classification. Our large, complex flagship, UT Knoxville, is on the far right. And you can see that research funding, doctoral degrees, those things are weighted more heavily at those schools where that's part of their mission. And other things are weighted less heavily. And again, this weighting structure is designed to sort of reflect the mission of that campus, what it is the state wants to pay those schools to do. If schools were to increase their bachelor's degrees, that means a lot more for our small liberal arts schools than it does for our flagship. And we need our flagship to be doing other things like research and graduate degrees, et cetera. So these last few slides show the two main moving parts of the finance formula here in Tennessee, the use of outcomes without enrollments whatsoever, and this institutional specific weighting structure that folds around the mission of a campus and essentially puts on paper what it is the state will pay that campus to produce. Move to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about how this has worked. We have now used this model in its entirety for two straight budget years, 2011-12 and 2012-13. We use the model for the allocation of all state funding. We're not waiting around on new money. We don't think it's appropriate to only apply models like this if and when there's new money. We think that a model like this works whether appropriations are stagnant, increasing, or decreasing. If you go to the next slide, what this really means, and this is a key reform I want to stress here, is that all state funding is back up for grabs every year. We have tried to attack what I'll refer to as the entitlement mentality to state funding, meaning that institutions feel like their funding is in fact theirs and they ought not to relinquish it unless there's large-scale cuts. We no longer take that view. We now take the view that all appropriations basically come back to a central location, if you will, and then we send them back out every year based on the new productivity levels, the new outcomes. Each institution essentially has to re-earn its dollars every year. This is an extraordinary change, I would submit, and it is one that raised some important questions in Tennessee, but it is one that in many ways is just as important as the use of outcomes in a model. Because of this, and this segues to the next slide, because of this backup for grabs approach to the funding, What that means is that every year the entirety of our allocation is reallocated, and therefore you have the possibility that the model could be too volatile. And this is a point that our campuses raised, and it was a valid point. But what we did was we tried to address this by I'll basically say engineering the model to appropriately balance the volatility and stability. We didn't want a model that would suddenly in 1 year slash one school's funding by 20% and give it to another school where you saw funding shifting around every year. However, we wanted a model that would in fact let state funding gravitate towards those institutions who were demonstrably being more productive than their peers were. If the money is not able to flow to the productive schools, you might as well not even have a finance policy, not even have a funding formula. If you then take this idea and look on the next slide at graphically what this looks like, here's what we've seen the first 2 years. What you're seeing there is, across our 9 public universities, the by-year level of change in the reallocation of state funding. In other words, if you just took the same global level of appropriations across those 2 years and just simply reallocated the same overall dollars out to the campuses, here's how our schools have responded. I'll focus on the top line because it's the most distinctive. That's Austin Peay State University. Across both of the 2 years we've used this model, Austin Peay has increased their outcomes faster than any other university. Therefore, they have begun to see more appropriations come their way. In the first year, almost 1% more. This past year, almost 2.5% more. Other schools have relinquished funding to Austin Peay because their outcomes have simply not been increasing as fast. This is the reallocation that we're talking about. The next slide shows the exact same thing but for our community colleges. And again, the point of this is not so much the specific numbers themselves, but the fact that the model every year reallocates funding, and it does so in a measured way. We'll often compare this to if you were looking at a stock ticker. An individual company stock is not going to surge up and down 15, 20% day by day. It instead will move incrementally within a reasonable range, and over time you see real movements in the underlying value of that asset. Same thing here. As we begin to have this history unfold, we're going to see schools over time command a larger and larger share of funding as their outcomes change over time. Going to the next slide, that's basically the same information but displayed in another format. For interest of time, I want to skip past this one and go to the next slide. So to sum up a few things here and talk about why we think this has really been beneficial for Tennessee, as David said, this model is directly linking back to the goals of Tennessee's public agenda, which identified educational attainment, workforce development as the primary policy goals in Tennessee. The use of this model, we think, really establishes a framework for state government and higher education to have an ongoing policy conversation. As the state identifies different things that it needs from its higher education system, the outcomes model is easy to adjust. You simply would add a different outcome. You may change your weights to reflect different expectations for different campuses, but it sort of embeds within it that same conversation. If you have an enrollment-based model, changes in the state's mission for its higher education system, changes in the identity of institutions themselves are really difficult to incorporate into a model. The outcomes model really embeds those conversations in the calculations. The last slide I believe I have is just a couple more points. We think that the main innovation here is the structure that we chose, this use of outcomes exclusively, and the individual campus weights to reflect the mission of that campus. That's the innovation. The specific outcomes that we chose and the weights that we chose really fit what Tennessee needs. But we are firm believers that other states could adopt this general mechanism, this general design, figure out for themselves what it is that state values, what it is that state needs from its campuses, have weights to reflect that, and use a model just like this. The mathematics work. It is a far better policy instrument, we believe, because it does get away from funding enrollments, and it funds what the state needs in this era of needing a completion agenda. And we think that the evidence from these first 2 years affirms that view, that it has in fact worked for us. we're starting to see outcome changes in Tennessee. In fact, I've often heard heads of institutions and heads of systems say that there are very few aspects of a campus that the use of an outcomes model is not impacting, because everything they do now has to be geared towards whether or not that expenditure helps improve their outcomes. And if not, schools are taking a much more careful look at how they spend their money because of that. So the first 2 years we think have worked well for us. At this point, I believe that'll conclude our slides, and we do point to our website for more information. But Jonathan, at this point, I guess we would be open for entertaining questions.
Jonathan, there are currently no questions, so if anybody wants to put those in, we will definitely let our people answer those. So if anybody, once again, just type into the question box, and we will forward those to everybody to be answered.
While people are thinking of their questions, I'll address one point that has come up here recently, and that is you might rightfully ask, well, do you have any evidence that all of this is having the desired effect on completions? And as Russ mentioned, we have heard through anecdotes talking with campus folks about complete overhauls of the way that institutions interact with their students to try to remove red tape, to try to make transitions smoother, look at academic policies on campus, fiscal policies, student affairs, services, things of that nature, through the lens of, what can we do to make sure that students are as likely as possible to succeed. But we've actually begun to see it in the completions numbers. Last year we saw it begin to trickle through the certificates. This year, with some preliminary data from 11-12 that we've seen on the associate degree programs, and I would imagine beginning this year and on into the next, we'll begin to see it in the bachelor's degree areas, where we actually are, beginning to see upticks in performance by each institution. I talked about having a 4% annual increase, and we met that on the backs of our certificates and associates programs last year, and I believe we're going to meet that again this year. Of course, the bar gets higher every year as that base gets higher, and you have to build that 4% off of a higher base. But it is having the desired impact so far.
Okay, we see a few questions coming in, and I'll try to go through these and answer them as best I can. The first one was, how hard was it to convince the campuses that this was a good idea? A couple things. This was, I would liken it to sort of baseball, motherhood, and apple pie. In the abstract, it was hard for the policy entity in Tennessee to oppose it, because in the abstract it sounds like a great idea. When you get down to the numbers and the bottom line, a bit of a different story. However, the way we addressed that was, we said that when we were going to go to an outcomes model, we would try to have this new approach pick up where the old enrollment model left off. So in the short term, there'd be very few transitional costs. And then from this point forward, schools can compete for funding, and they can go off in different directions. But because we tried to establish that minimal transitional cost, I think everybody felt it was a fair starting point, because it wasn't going to immediately be utilized to alter funding in year number one. So therefore, a lot of the anxiety was taken away. I would also point out that I think this is particularly true for community colleges, the outcomes model includes so many outcomes that for years they've been pursuing, and the state has largely ignored from a funding perspective. No one ever asked them before, how much workforce training do you do? Let's fund you for that. Because of the inclusion of those outcomes, I think it was an extraordinarily easy model to sell because of the things we were now going to reward them for doing. Let's see. Are there more? George?
Craig Horn, I think we answered your question about the impact. Lots of impact in the kinds of activities at institutions, policy reviews and things of that nature, and we're beginning to see the numbers favorable numbers trickle in. So that was in answer to Craig's question. Russ answered Jennifer's. And now we have George asking how have the universities dealt with less state funding if that has occurred.
Yeah, that has occurred. You've had, of the 2 years of the use of the model, the first year there was a small decline in state funding, and this most recent year you had an uptick in state funding. So overall, we are ahead of where we were a couple of years ago. And so we haven't yet had to run this model in a year where we were having to slash funding by 10% like we all were during the recession. So we've yet to really deal with it on a severe downside.
Then there's a question about were there any surprises as you implemented changes or unintended consequences? That's from Marshall Hill. Hey, Marshall. One, and Russ, maybe you can take this and expand on it, but I know one of the, I doubt we weren't surprised by it, but one of the unintended consequences I think had to do with once you tell institutions that you're going to fund them for something, they begin to invent all kinds of ways to make that occur. And some of them are probably very legitimate, others are more open to debate. So we are in the middle of a debate right now. For instance, part of the Complete College Tennessee Act is that we developed a 41-hour common general education core, which research has showed has a very positive impact on the likelihood of students graduating if they complete that. So it's a good thing. Well, some of the institutions then develop certificates around the Common Gen Ed core and begin counting that as, they were hoping that we would count that as an outcome. And so, Russ, what was the philosophy of the funding formula committee once you began to be inundated with all these shorter-term certificates, some of which might be actually legitimate and others that were open for debate? What did you decide to, how did you cut that?
Yeah, well, we wanted to appropriately reward institutions if they were producing certificates, workforce training certificates, but we also wanted to make sure that they fit within the spirit of an outcomes formula, the Complete College Tennessee Act. Therefore, if a student was awarded a short-term certificate and that's all the student achieved, then we're including that in the model. If they're still pursuing an associate's degree or a higher degree, then we would count that instead. But trying to strike a balance between appropriately rewarding institutions and being within the spirit of the outcomes formula and the CCTA.
Douglas Carr asks, am I correct that the institutions were categorized for weighting purposes by a Carnegie class, and was additional information also used to group institutions for weighting purposes? You know, we did include a lot of additional information besides the Carnegie class, but I would imagine you can go back and look at this exercise and you would see these institutions grouping predominantly by Carnegie. Russ and I were actually just talking earlier today about really the key. I think it was a good exercise to go through and actually have these institutions reflect on their non-aspirational mission statements, and but really the most important thing is being presented with the array of metrics and then deciding, based upon our mission, how do we weight these measures differentially for our institution. I'm not sure if going forward we would have to group the institutions because the weighting kind of does that for you. Now, Russ, what's your reflection on that? Are you?
No, that's about right. One point I would add to that is that we got the higher ed community's input on all of these aspects. We asked campus presidents how do they evaluate what their mission is, and they got to weigh in on that point as well. This was not done in a vacuum. This was done with state government and higher ed all at the table.
Okay, Marshall asked the difficult question. Says no, this is Kathleen. Kathleen Marshall. Okay. Do you foresee that after several years using the outcomes model, one or more of your institutions may simply fail?
Yeah. Well, that is an interesting question, Kathleen. Short answer is I don't think so, and a couple reasons for that. For one is that in many ways the use of an outcomes model is financially more stable than enrollment models. I mean, we've seen enrollments fluctuate wildly in the past few years from the recession, and then now that those are receding because people are going back to work. Outcomes themselves, the number of degrees you produce, the other outcomes of the model, are in many ways inherently more stable, and there's 10 of them, not a single variable based on enrollment. So in that way, it's more stable than the enrollment model. And also because of the way it was engineered not to be too volatile in any given year, but over time it would shift money, I don't think we would have that problem. If we did have a school whose outcomes were so bad that it threatened their state funding and threatened their existence, that will be obvious to many policymakers in Tennessee from a distance. It'll be a slow-moving train. We'll be able to see it coming and deal with that ahead of time.
This may just be a different way of saying what Russ just said. It's sort of like a car with a lot of play in the steering wheel. It's like you can begin to turn before the car actually turn the wheel before the car actually begins to respond, because we use 3 years of lagged indicators for each metric. The other thing about that was, oh yeah, so Russ is right. The institutions sort of see it coming down the tracks if they're beginning to be less than competitive in the funding formula. But we also provide tuition ranges that we recommend for institutions to charge in terms of tuition. And so an institution that might have a bad year in terms of funding formula might choose to go to the top end of that range for tuition. Of course, they couldn't do that year after year after year and survive. But there is room, there's time for institutions to turn things around. The next question is from Matt. It says, was the outcomes formula a legislative or a board mandate? And the answer to that is it was legislative, although the commission was given a lot of flexibility in how we actually implemented that. And Russ, you may say more about that. Worked with the Funding Formula Review Committee over a period of 9 to 12 months, and there was a whole lot of back and forth. This thing was not a fait accompli. You know, sometimes you get a group together knowing exactly how it's going to turn out. We knew what we were going to turn out with a funding formula, but we didn't know exactly how it was going to look. And that, I think, is a testament to the input that the process utilized. Thanks. These are good questions. How did the campuses deal with the unknown of their budget being 100% at risk? In reality, what was the range of their budgets going up or down?
Yeah, the answer to that question are really those slides we showed towards the end where you looked at how the state appropriations changed in the first 2 years of the model. So because of the way it's designed, because even though it's 100% based on outcomes, because of the inherent stability of those outcomes, most schools are moving within about a plus or minus 3 to 4% range in any given year. And so there's an appropriate balance, we think, between stability and volatility. So from a campus perspective, I mean, in many ways, they would have to start dealing with their internal budget much the same way any other business would, which is some uncertainty about your revenues and not being entitled to just what you got last year, having to re-earn that. That definitely introduces some uncertainty, but it's a nice motivating factor, we think.
Bradley Summerhill asks, does the model harm institutions that are already performing well? In other words, do poorly performing institutions get the chance to gain while highly performing institutions have nowhere to go?
This is Russ. I'll address that. That's a good question because I think I heard this same point from every campus during the process because they all felt that they were doing well on certain outcomes and that we would effectively be penalizing them because of their good performance. However, in every case, and this is true for community colleges on up through to our flagship, in every case, we could point to data where campuses could improve and could do better and were not performing as well as they should, and as well as they even said they should to their own board members. So in theory, that was sometimes a concern, but in practice, when you look at the data, when you look at our institutions, everybody did well on certain things and was already doing poorly on others and had room to improve.
But one thing about your question, Brad, is that, Russ, you might want to say a little bit about there was a hold harmless provision under the old enrollment formula, there were institutions that had sort of won under that system and others that had lost, and the hold harmless was put in place. This isn't an exactly direct answer to Brad's question, but I think it's important to talk about how we did recognize that we needed a way to sort of bring institutions to a soft landing.
Yeah. What David is saying is true. But basically, to put this in the 30-second version, previous to the outcomes model, Tennessee had chosen not to reallocate funding as enrollments changed. And so you had certain schools funded at 70% of their recommendation, others at 50%, and there was not equity across the institutions in their funding. That was what we always called a hold harmless or a stop loss. We have since removed that, so we basically prorate out available funding across institutions, so every school is funded at the same percentage of their recommendation, which allows the money to shift campus by campus, year by year.
We're getting near the end. We're going to try to hit a couple of questions really quickly. One is, how often will the outcomes and/or weights be reviewed and weights possibly reconsidered?
On that question, we usually will tie that to the master planning cycle. Every 5 years, I think THEC, along with the legislature and the governor, will take a look at the public agenda for Tennessee and decide again if our goals are still in the right spot. If so, then the funding formula will follow that public agenda. It's meant to be the financial reflection of that public agenda, and usually about every 5 years we take a look at that. At that point, then we'll reconsider the weights and the outcomes themselves.
George asked, did the Tennessee legislature have sole responsibility in creating this model, or was it incumbent on the boards of the higher education?
Yeah, the General Assembly, the legislation called for THEC to create the model. So THEC has statutory authority to construct it itself, and of course we initially built it and continue to review it with input from the General Assembly, from state government, from the institutions themselves. It's an everyone at the table approach.
And the last question has to do with how is funding for new facilities determined?
Yeah, that is a separate process from our funding formula. Capital outlay funding is made in a separate process that's distinct from what we're talking about today.
That's all the questions that we've gotten online.
Well, I appreciate all that. I appreciate all the questions. Thank you again all for joining us. If you do have a question that either didn't get answered or you didn't think of until late, you can send them to my attention at jhull@csg.org, and I will do my best to forward it back along and see if we can get an answer to you. I hope this has been beneficial to everybody in your states as you look at higher ed finance. The webinar has been recorded. We'll be posting it shortly to the CSG Knowledge Center and to the SLC website. There's more information on the Complete College Tennessee Act at the SLC website as well. I want to thank Russ and David once again for your presentation and all the time you've put into this for us. We really do appreciate it. I also want to thank Heather King at THEC and Heather Perkins at the Council of State Governments for their technical support. I'll bring to your attention one more complimentary webinar from CSG on increasing access to post-secondary education. That will be held on Wednesday, November 14th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It includes remarks from Connecticut Senator Beth Bayh, Chair of the Senate Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee, Lucille Davey, a Senior Advisor with the James B. Hunt Jr. Institute for Educational Policy and Leadership, and Laura Bedner, Associate Commissioner for the Arkansas Department of Education. You can sign up for that one at the CSG website. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us today. If you have questions or if you have comments about them, please do let us know. My email again is jhull@csg.org. Thanks so much.